Okay, we're going to start with a presentation on what is Seattle 2035, what is HALA, and we hope it's primarily informational and straightforward. The person who's going to give it is Greg Hill. Greg has been involved with Wallingford Community Council since, now do any of you here remember the McDonald's down at 45th and Stone? Okay, when that went in, that was a couple of blocks from Greg's house. And Greg said, just like any one of you, what is going on here? And became active in the community council. He's been active ever since. He's an architect. His main task as an architect is designing transit stations all over North America. And I'm hoping that someday we get him to do one at Northgate, or even further north. So I'm going to give it over to Greg. I'm going to give you this, and he's going to get this started.
Thanks, Mike. So the first slide you saw was actually a reminder that this isn't the only community or city that is under pressure from developers to do things that advantage them. Okay, it sounds really loud because I'm right in front of this. So New York City has just had a referendum of sorts where all 5 boroughs, 50 out of 59 sub-communities voted against zoning changes that were dressed up to look like something that would be affordable, but in fact were just ways for developers to generate more profits. So go ahead, Lee. So we're here because this dark line represents the outline of the Wallingford residential urban village. And one of the mayor's proposals is to take all the light yellow pieces, which look a little gray here, that are all single family, and change those to multifamily. And I'm going to try and explain some of the precursors to doing that, as well as what's involved in doing that, and some of the potential outcomes. So land use is kind of determined from the state. There's a Growth Management Act that was passed 30 years ago that basically says you have to plan. And your plan has to be concurrent. In other words, if you plan for a lot of residential, a lot of commercial, you have to also provide transportation and sewers and so forth. So the plan needs to be concurrent. It also has an interesting feature that the plans can be appealed by citizens. So if the city of Seattle does a plan and you don't like it, you can appeal to the shoreline, the Growth Management Hearings Board. Those plans then are pushed down to the regions. And for us, that's the Puget Sound Regional Council. It's made up of elected officials, and the committees are made up of the staff from various communities as well as Puget Sound Regional Council staff. So they develop plans for growth and transportation, and those plans then basically allocate where the growth will be. And in our case, Mike Begin was mayor, and he told Tom Hogger, representing the city, who went to a meeting with a lot of staff from other counties, to take more than our share. It's not clear whether he also got a response to give more money to help us solve that problem, but that's how we got the target we have now. And Wallingford Residential Village actually had a target to increase by 400 units. So we did our neighborhood plan in 1994. And before the plan was actually approved, we had the 400 and more. Not sure if there's been any concurrent development in terms of transportation that you might recognize. We do have more buses. We do have bike lanes. But that's basically kind of how we get to where we are, is starts with the state, goes to the region, comes to the city. So one thing to keep in mind in all of these discussions is the 2035, which is the city's comp plan proposal, they have calculated that we have enough capacity, zoned capacity today, to handle all our growth for more than the next 20 years. So we don't have to rezone anything. even though you're going to hear, if you read the papers, if you listen to developers, that, oh, we have to do something immediately. Right now, we have to change everything. And that's where this concept came. Developers cut a deal with the mayor, and they had a long wish list, and on that wish list was taking all the single-family zoned areas within the villages and converting them to multifamily. It's not because we need that capacity, because we already have it, but it's because they wanted. Go ahead, Lee. So what does it really do? Well, there are 4 or 5 things that I've pointed out. There are many more, but our comp plan has today single-family zoning criteria. In other words, it says, if 70% of the buildings on a block face are in single-family use, then that qualifies to be a single-family zone. The mayor wants to eliminate that. And of course, if you don't have the criteria, then you don't have anything to argue about in terms of preventing change. He also wants to obviously eliminate the areas in our village. He also wants to eliminate the public process. So today, if you want to change the zoning within the village, you actually have to reopen the village plan, and that would involve talking to you guys. So he'd like to not have to do that. And lastly, on my list here is he continues to fortify the parking myth in kind of new and interesting ways where, nobody owns a car anymore, so we don't really need parking, right? And this is actually something that was developed to deal with 2 groups. I used to think of myself as a radical environmentalist. I guess I'm getting too old. But they want to force people to stop using their cars by giving them no place to park. And then there are the low-end developers who would like to make more money, and they would like to externalize the cost of parking onto the streets so they don't have to pay for it. And that allows them to basically make more profit. Because the price of units, this is very important. So let's say there are roughly 300,000 units, houses, apartments in the city. And you're going to build a 30-unit project. And if you can build 2 more units, is that going to make it affordable? No. No. The price charged for those units is always going to be the market price based on the 300,000 plus King County as well. It's a gigantic number of housing units out there. So any individual project is not going to create affordable housing no matter what happens. It's not going to change. You can't solve this problem by supply. The problem's too big. But you can, on an individual project, increase the profit margin if you don't have to do certain things. Now, the comp plan today says that if you're doing affordable housing, that's one reason why you might not have to do parking. Now, that's a pretty good connection. Of course, the mayor's changing that. The new comp plan rubric says if you can lower the cost of the project, it's okay to get rid of the parking. So, well, getting rid of the parking is always going to lower the cost. It's kind of automatic. But he's breaking the link to the affordable housing. And as we go through this, I think you'll see more places where the links are being broken. Here are a couple of others I just picked out at random, but these are kind of my favorites. Comp plan really values existing trees and actually promotes more trees. We're going to get rid of that. It encourages, the new comp plan, the current comp plan discourages growth in environmentally critical areas. The new comp plan gets rid of that. And the future land use map. Now, land use was created basically to stabilize the value of property. It's a promise that your property, what's going on around your property, is not going to change. But the future land use map, known affectionately to people who follow this as the FLUM, basically wants to blur the lines. They want to have kind of general areas. They don't want to actually draw a line and say, on this side it's commercial, on that side it's residential. So that's another problem, I think. So a little land use history. Seattle's first zoning was in 1923, and that's basically you're reading what the code was, and there was a map, we think, but I don't know where it is. And all the way up to 1973, and go ahead and we'll see, this is the zoning map, 1973. You'll see on the left side, I actually live over there. 45th is across the bottom here, Stoneway on the diagonal. Left of that was RD 5000, that's residential duplex 5,000. The minimum size of the lot has to be 5,000. And that was actually changed and made single family in the 80s. And the rest is all single family. And this is the area, this is one little piece actually of the area slated to be rezoned to multifamily. So in the 60s, this is kind of typically what was happening. You had a one-story building up on stilts with parking underneath. No front yard to speak of, just a kind of a parking ramp. And you know, there are a lot of these around the neighborhood. And so then we back up. In 82, the city adopted performance zoning. This was the catchword developers came up with to describe more. And so this project basically replaced one of those other projects. The old project had 4 units, this one has 16. And there were elements of this as well. On the right-hand side, you can see a deck. Oh, you can't. I guess they didn't build it. But that was the open space on that deck that never got built. Enforcement's always been kind of a problem in the city. So the mayor Royer, responded to an outraged citizenry by saying, okay, too much, too big, too ugly. And they proposed changes to the zoning. The citizenry rose up and said, we don't like your changes. And during the EIS period, they actually insisted that they study another alternative, which was option 2. So we had basically status quo or option 1, now there was option 2. And option 2 increased open space, had landscaping requirements, you had to plant trees, they had setbacks, height limits, and unit lot density. Unit lot density says, based on the size of the lot, you divide it by a number, 1,200, and that's the number of units you can build on that lot. Well, we got rid of that eventually, but that basically guaranteed what the building numbers of units would be, and it also gave you a rough idea of how big it would be. It also encouraged larger units, because you can only build 6 units, you're probably going to build bigger units. But now they got rid of that, so now the idea is to build smaller units because there's kind of a baseline revenue amount for a very tiny unit, and then the next unit's a small increment. So the smaller units you build, the more profit. Well, that was kind of the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. The commercial code was redone in '85. The 45th Street was downzoned from 60 feet to 40 feet. To my mind, that's a good thing. A lot of architects think we live in Italy. That's actually quite a bit south of where we are. A lot more sunshine, longer days. And so if 45th Street, which runs east and west, had 60-foot buildings all along the south side, it would be a pretty dreary place for a good deal of the year. And then, because there was unit lot density, apartment builders started building in commercial zones. And the city council realized that was a problem because we're going to lose the teeth. You know, our 45th Street strip is kind of like a mall. It's an outdoor mall. And those businesses are all dependent on people walking up and down the street. And actually walking up and down the street has to be a good experience if you want people to come to your mall. And obviously if every other storefront was blank because it was a residential building, that would be a problem. Jim Street was on the city council at that point. He saw that was an issue. There was an appeal of a project in Madrona that would actually have taken 25% of that commercial area away for one residential project. And he wrote the mixed-use ordinance, which basically says, in a commercial zone, if you want to build residential, you have to have ground floor commercial. And then it limited the size, actually, the bulk of the building above that. That meant 2 things. One, we didn't lose teeth in our mall front. 2, it provided lots of small spaces where little startups could get going. Not much use to big commercial establishments. but really helpful to small, locally owned businesses. So it actually became a national model. And people came from all over the country to see this. So these are the residential units that came out of the option 2. So they're basically 2.5 stories tall and tend to have pitched roofs. And you know, when the code's changed, now most everything has a flat roof, looks like a box. Go ahead. And there were some bad things too. The six-packs. And people didn't like six-packs. It was hard to get into the parking spaces, so people didn't actually use them, or they became home gyms or whatever, storage. So people didn't like those, and obviously they didn't enforce the landscape requirements in all cases. This is up north of, in the Howler Lake neighborhood, I think. And these are some of the examples of the good news on mixed use. So the upper right is kind of typical mixed use. Very strong commercial base, residential above. It was all set back because there was a limit to how much lot coverage you could have there. Abundant landscape. This is the Wallingford lofts in the lower left. And then this is the plaza at 45th and Stone Way that was built as a result of design review and so forth. Go ahead. And then into 2000s, 96, we got the neighborhood plan passed. So we had, important thing there, there was a South Wallingford amendment, because South Wallingford was left out of the village, so therefore there was no plan, but obviously a lot going on down there. And then finally in 2005, we got the neighborhood guidelines for design review. So we had a three-legged stool. We had a good code, we had a neighborhood plan, and we had design review for big projects coming in. Pretty good deal. And then, of course, the empire struck back. As we were all kind of relaxing, Peter Steinbrück decided to run for mayor. He was still on the council, but he had this notion he wanted to run for mayor, needed to raise money. So the developers came and said, we'd like you to change the code. First of all, these mixed-use things, we don't like them. And it's true, you know, most people, there are a few exceptions, do not want to build mixed use. They want to build residential primarily. And the interesting thing was, and the reason it became a national model, because we required it, banks actually started doing these mixed-use loans. That was part of why it became a national model. Prior to that, when you walked into a bank, you go over here for residential, you go here for commercial, they never talked to each other. But the market was so hot when this happened initially that they just started doing it, and they didn't actually count the commercial component in their pro forma. A few years later, the bond market got tight, the banks started looking closer, but by then they had a track record. So actually regulation caused all this good stuff to happen. But go ahead. So Peter changed that. These are examples of live-work units. Basically, it's more live than work. And obviously not much opportunity for small commercial. And then another big event happened. Initiative 52, the Roads and Transit Initiative. So this was a deal where they had both money for roads and transit on the same ballot. And Transportation Choices, which is Councilmember Johnson's former outfit, they were in favor of it. Sierra Club came out strongly against it, but the outcome, which it failed, but the outcome was more sinister, because the developers figured out that they needed to get some control over these environmental groups. So they started to invest in them. And pretty soon they developed notions about, well, there could be good development out in the burbs or on your block. And good development, of course, defined by more profits. And they were very careful. They got affordable, started to get into the language. That's when it started to be popular to talk about affordable things. And it's all kind of based on this alternate set of facts. If you remember Ronald Reagan and trickle-down economics, you know, if people get rich on the top, it's bound to work down below. Go ahead, Lee. So things then got worse in the multifamily zones as well. Sally Clark came in. People were complaining about six-packs, and unfortunately, the developers were very clever. They used that to change the code to make it some would say less advantageous and more difficult for people to accept. They decreased the setbacks. They changed the height measurements to allow extra stories to be built. They have bogus bonuses. I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then DPD started doing these wild interpretations. So the way it works today is when a new project is sent to DPD, they publish it. You have 2 weeks to make a comment on that project. If you think the zoning is not correct, in other words, they've not calculated correctly, you have to pay $2,500 plus $300 an hour, something like that, to ask them the question, does 2 and 2 really equal 5? If you don't pay the money, they consider it's all done. So even though you may go down to DPD, as Eastlake did, and said, how can this 3-story building be 6 stories tall? And it's because the way they figured the FAR, they didn't count the first 3 floors. DPD just says, oh, no, you missed your opportunity. We're not responsible now. So that's what I mean by DPD interpretation changes. They basically no longer accept that they're the policeman. They're actually the developer's client, if you will, to help them through the process. In 2015, Sally Clark, just before she left office to go work at the UW, she put together a series of amendments. She realized this was really bad news. And she put together a series of amendments. But Mike O'Brien took over, and Mike was successful in defeating almost every amendment to lower the heights, to improve the setbacks. They actually did make one little setback change. And if you do the next slide, hold on to your hat. So this was a 3-story zone before Sally Clark made the change. And a couple things happened. The ground floor doesn't count because the former grade was actually higher than where the building is today. So they don't count the ground floor. Doesn't count in height, doesn't count in FAR, floor area ratio. And the top floor, I still can't explain, except all these fancy roofs up there are what the architects wanted to do. And so they get a bonus for the top half of the building, the top third of the building, there is a bonus. So there's a bonus at the bottom because it's half below the former grade, and there's a bonus at the top because the roof's unusual. So as a result, instead of a 3-story building, you have a 5-story building. And the developers in HALA, which the mayor is proposing, want to add a floor. So if they change the zoning from single family to multifamily, and if they made it L2, for example, that's what you're getting. Go ahead.
Isn't that really a 6-story building? Because that upper floor has inside.
Those are only lofts, and as long as they're less than a certain percentage, they don't count them. It's part of the whole bonus routine. And the part that was really irritating when we went to Mike O'Brien is we were saying, okay, you've got all these bonuses, so why do you grant them if you're not getting affordable housing? And his response was, we're getting more. That's all that's important. Yeah, that's the important thing. We're getting more. So here's another couple of good ones. So when they decided to get rid of the front setbacks, I went down to the council, and I had been out east during the summer. I'd taken some pictures in Cambridge and others in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of urban houses. And I had discovered that if you were 15 feet back from the sidewalk, generally your blinds were open. And if you were closer than that, generally your blinds were closed. So I went to the city council and I explained this principle and suggested they keep the front setback at 15 feet, and they, of course, didn't do that. But I was wrong. The blinds on the right, as you can see, are not open or closed. There are no windows. So they outsmarted me on that one. And then on the left, you can see what 0 setback means. Now, how do you build that wall? You build it from the neighbor's property. Does DPD restrict or govern this in any way? Not really. No, you can do whatever you want. That's on somebody else's property. That's not their problem. Go ahead. So the basics here are changes to single-family zoning within urban villages. Changing them to multifamily, what does that do? Higher taxes. Well, that's what people think. Actually, the Board of Equalization has this principle where they can't raise your taxes just because they've changed the zoning. But our council member has another view on this. Lee, you want to try and roll that? This is a little clip from a debate between Rob Johnson and Mike Maddox. And we're just going to watch a few seconds here because the issue was taxes and this very specific thing of raising taxes when they change your zoning.
It's the property taxes. Right now we pay property taxes based on the value of the land and the value of your building on top of that land. There's models that have been shown to be very successful in other parts of the country that would allow you to charge somebody based on the value of their assessed property. So if you're in a neighborhood that is assessed to be able to go to 3 stories and you're in a single family home, we're going to charge you as though you're a 2-story building. That's going to encourage more turnover in places where we want to see higher density. It would help flatten out some of the construction booms and busts that we see. When I talk to economists, they also believe that it would really help us, just generally think through our growth strategies by encouraging people to buy those places and then turn them over more quickly. So, when I think about the tax structure that we've got, it certainly isn't perfect. I'm a proponent of tax reform.
So I'm not a big proponent of turnover. I've lived in my house since 1981. I've renovated the house. I rebuilt the garage. I've spent an inordinate amount of time turning leaves into my garden to make the soil work. And I'm not too anxious to have somebody build a giant building right next to me. Can we go back to those slides, Lee? So what I think we have to lose here is kind of a loss of control. That's kind of what zoning is all about, is you have control based on what people can do on their lots. And that's kind of what we're losing. Higher taxes is a potential to drive people out. And there's also a psychological impact. If somebody built that stuff next to you, and in Ballard, how many people here have received a letter, an anonymous letter, basically asking for somebody to buy their house? Anybody got one of those? Yeah.
We're willing to buy your house as is.
Well, trust me, you haven't seen the letter that the folks in Ballard are getting. These are people who live in single-family houses in a multifamily zone. They get a letter saying, I just bought the lot next to you. I'm going to erect a 40-foot-high building right next to your building. It's going to totally put your whole lot in shadow. I'm going to be constructing that building for a year. It's going to be noisy and dirty. It's going to ruin your life. Wouldn't you like to sell your property? Now, unfortunately, I was not able to get that letter tonight and put it up here. But I've seen this letter, and it's pretty outrageous. So that's what I mean by psychological effect. So HALA wants to increase the heights in multifamily from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 stories. In commercial, they want to add 2 stories, so the south side of 45th Street, right, would be at least 60 feet tall. And the bogus bonuses. So there still is no link between all these bonuses and affordable housing. And they seem unwilling to create such a link, which is what really might actually help. The Seattle Times wrote a great editorial 2.5 weeks ago on a Sunday. A lot of good quotes. Ever taller buildings, doubling or tripling the density of single-family zones. And so the red areas here are where you guys live. I actually live in the upper left-hand little triangle up there, and these are the areas that are specifically being targeted for rezoning. There are other villages with the same thing going on, and so we're going to try and reach out to those folks and see if we can get any interest in resisting this change. Go ahead, Lee. Basically, the mayor's grand bargain, it's important to know that it's not all his fault, but since Murray took office, more affordable housing has been destroyed than at any prior time in our history. The practice, now this is a quote from the Daily Journal of Commerce. I don't know if you know who this is a developer newspaper. It's published during the week. They're saying the practice of tearing down affordable units and replacing them with denser development has not proven to yield the results that we sought, and it never will. The concept is if we just keep building more, it'll all work out. It's trickle-down economics, and it doesn't work. And in fact, when you allow more to be built on a lot, it actually makes it easier, more affordable to tear down existing lower-cost units because you've got more profit to cover the cost of demolishing a bigger building. Go ahead. The parking myth. This is the one I love the best. So presently, if you're within 1,200 feet, I think it is, of a bus line that's regular, you don't have to provide parking. In Wallingford, you may be familiar with the project at 4516 Meridian. It's right behind the new CVS. It's a tall, red checkerboard thing. 42 units, no parking. There's another project next to the library. That will be another 42 units, I believe, and it'll have 20 spaces because we talked to them and they responded. There's another project under construction on Stoneway just west of, on 45th just west of Stoneway. That's another 40 units, no parking. So basically we've got about 124 units either constructed or under construction with 20 parking spaces. You don't have to do the math to figure out why that might be a problem. And interestingly enough, there are two big impacts. One is on small business. When you externalize your parking onto the streets, those streets are, the small businesses in Wallingford are totally dependent on that parking for their customers. The regional change, like CVS is actually a national chain, but the regional chains, national chains, they tend to have their own parking lots. So they're not really affected that much. But the locally owned businesses, I think slob is a good word, right? Small locally owned business, people we don't care about anymore. I think we care about them. But the city seems to have forgotten about them. They are completely dependent on street parking and that shared resource to do business. And when you allow the developers to externalize their parking costs and put those cars on the street, and then the first thing everybody wants an RPZ. It's a very natural reaction, but that's actually going to hurt the small businesses. The other thing is the pedestrian realm suffers. So the rabid environmentalists that are thinking they're going to force you out of your cars actually are destroying the pedestrian realm that you need to really build a strong neighborhood. So I have problems with this. And again, I think the loss of affordable housing is the biggest deal with this proposal the mayor has. John Fox from the Displacement Coalition has calculated that we're losing 11 affordable units for every one we build. And more interesting quotes from the Times. Go ahead. That's the end of the line. So I appreciate your watching, listening.